Good morning, everyone. We'll make a start. We're in a bit of a competition with the presentations over there, but hopefully, can you all hear me clearly? Yeah? Okay, great. So this morning's session is about nature-based solutions and how nature-based solutions can operate in cities and address some of the challenges that we have in cities. My name's Peter Massini. I work for the Greater London Authority, and I'm chairing the session, and I'll be introducing the other speakers. So I just want to provide a little bit of context about why this is deemed to be sort of critical infrastructure. As many of you know, most of our cities are growing. London in particular will have to become a much denser city in the future to accommodate the population growth that's projected for the future. Most of our cities have very good planning systems that protect the core network of green spaces. But as you can see in this image, just protecting green space isn't really the perfect solution. We need to think about how we integrate green infrastructure into that new development that will come on stream in the future to address a whole range of major challenges that all cities face. And those challenges range from the impacts of air quality, and even though we move towards electrification of our transport network, electrification of our heating network, cities by their very nature will always have dirtier air than perhaps some rural areas. So we still need to think about how we find other solutions to keep our air in cities as clean as possible. And we're also facing the really big impacts of climate change. Many cities around the world now, this is an existential threat to the city and to the economy of a city. And even in London, we're beginning to see not just the social impacts and environmental impacts of climate change, but some of the economic impacts of climate change. Particularly things like heat waves in the summer, which deters people from coming into the city. People don't like travelling on hot, stuffy tubes during a heat wave. They'll go to out-of-town shopping centres. So commercial operators in the centre of London are very concerned about the impacts of climate change and the economic impact that may have. And things like green infrastructure can provide some of those solutions. So like many other cities around the world, London has been developing a whole series of frameworks and guidance to try and encourage the implementation of nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. And we've now got a pretty good policy framework. The trick now is to turn that policy framework into practical solutions. And the speakers here today, hopefully, will be giving you some examples of how you can practically implement nature-based solutions and green infrastructure into cities. And their presentations will give you some ideas, some solutions to achieving that. So I'm going to stop there because I'm just chairing and introducing this. And I'll introduce our first speaker, who is Anne Yazulov, who's been working with the Trees and Design Action Group, developing guidance around how to ensure we can have a long-term, thriving, sustained tree canopy urban environments, how you actually get big trees into tight urban environments. So I'll hand over to Anne.
Good morning. I'm going to be presenting one of the guides we're about to publish this summer. It's a companion document to what we already have, which is this one. One way we've looked at producing guidance is identifying what are the key drivers for change in cities. I mean, we found that infrastructure projects, updates of footpaths, including incorporating cycle lanes, any infrastructure project offers opportunities for change and including trees. And now we're about to publish this new guide about trees planning and development. And our goal is to look at how we can ensure that trees are valued and a value-adding component to housing and commercial developments. I'm going to look at 10 tips. I'm going to go very quick. Our first tip, stemming from our research, is really to have a clear standards on the tree outcomes that are pursued, both from a quantitative and a qualitative perspective. And this applies whether from a local planning authority's perspective or from a sort of project design perspective. I'll have more of a look at the planning local authority perspective here without any clear policy standards on what needs to be achieved. If it's all up in the air, then this is often what we get. In the interviews we've done as part of our research, it's come up time and time again that if we want trees in new developments, we have to set a set quantum for it. This is clearly what Stefan Krokowski, one of the authors of Building for Life, was articulating to me, but it was equally what came out of discussion with many developers, that in respect to local policy, clarity is what matters most to them, including in the detail. And if Andrew Day, for instance, from Telford Home was telling me, if we are provided with figures, then we can factor them right away in our approach for the site. Now, there's various ways it can be done, but in respect to trees, I find the approach that Wickham has taken recently quite interesting. They've set a canopy cover target, not just for the whole borough, but in planning terms, a requirement for sites over a half hectare to reach a minimum of a 25% canopy cover outside of the city centre. And they've based this on research on their own level of canopy cover across different wards. They've done modeling across the types of densities between 28 and 32 dwelling per hectare to demonstrate the feasibility of this with different types of layouts. They've submitted this to the Planning Inspectorate, who reviewed the local plan, and it went through. And they've now about to publish an SPD that provides the developers with the actual methodology for looking at how to assess whether a given site will get to a 25% canopy cover within the set time frame given the policy. It's mostly based also on soil volumes. And if you cannot use trees to reach that target, there is the option to use other green infrastructure solutions. So that's one way it can be done. The second tip that stems from our research is to really take tree value into consideration in decision making. And again, this is something that bears impact from a local authority perspective, and I would say also from a design perspective for consultants. A good local authority example would be Camden, who for their replacement and planting approach require any suitable replacement providing at least equal amenity or ecological value. And the way, that's a policy in their local plan, and the way they look at this in terms of the implementation, the details are in their planning guidance. They require the use of CAVAT. Any tree survey, it's not just about identifying which trees are on site, but you're also using the capital asset valuation of how many trees to associate a tree value to each individual tree, so that when decisions are made on retention and removal, the impact of loss of amenity and ecological value can actually be quantified, so that any compensation payment or alternative planting can also be designed to achieve a comparable value. This is something that was done in Southwark, not because it was written into the local plan, but because the developer Lendlease decided to do so in response to a backlash from the local communities on lots of mature trees in the redevelopment of the Haygate estate. So it isn't something that necessarily in design term one needs to wait for the local authorities to absolutely require to do. It can be something that is done in terms of the design approach to the site, maintaining the value, ecological value of the tree population on site. My third tip is really to look at also what's the plan that is in place, and thinking of different time scale. Often the time dimension with tree is forgotten. Trees have a very different life cycle than a lamp column. Trees appreciate over time in value instead of depreciating. And thinking in terms of this value appreciation process has implications in terms of design consideration, possibly phasing, forward planting of infrastructure in terms of large-scale projects. And in terms of planning for the local authority, it also means bringing the planning for trees on par with planning for urban growth and urban development, which is a local plan typically is done on a 20, 40-year timescale. Then a set of tips around design principle. Really one, I would say, failure that seems to be seen over and over, that's often come very strongly in the interviews I've done, have been around the lack of understanding of how much priority is needed around using as big as a tree as the site can accommodate. What a missed opportunity here. And compared to this. Now, a second design consideration I think that often goes quite overlooked is prioritizing species diversity. And TDAG has published a guide on tree species choice that includes about 300 species that really provides in-depth detail to find the right species for the right site, so that we, enabling designers to go beyond the typical palette of 5-10 species that are used in every development project. Here's an example in Lyon. Another objection has always often been also design consideration, the need for uniformity. I really invite you to have a look and go perhaps travel to Lyon, France, which is one of the cities that has transformed its cityscape, almost achieving the golden rule of no more than 5% of a given species, no more than 10% in a family, and 20% in genus, and have a look at their streets. They have beautifully composed avenues with multiple species, or this square with 4 species, which absolutely is gorgeous. The ginkgos in the fall turn yellow. A lot can be done even aesthetically with diverse species. And my almost last design tip is around trees and suds. Why would not integrate trees and suds? Well, there's silos that gets in the way of that. There's sometimes adoption consideration that gets in the way of that, but I think less and less so. And the chance of, and the opportunity to create absolutely gorgeous landscapes that have a chance to reach their maturity is much greater if trees are provided with readily access to water and the nutrients that are also in the water, in the runoff water. Pollution is not so much necessarily an issue, and I'm happy to discuss this in the Q&A if there's questions on this. The data is there, and even in the UK, on the ability for trees to be really powerful assets for stormwater attenuations. And in terms of adoptions, I think mindsets are shifting. I was just talking recently to Central Bedfordshire, and their adoption framework and their cost schedule for it in terms of commuted sums, because it's all based on whole life costs. It incentivizes the integration of landscape and drainage solution, because they're much cheaper, they're actually charging much less to adopt based on whole life costing. So you have cost models like this. We know they exist, but when it's reflected by the adopting body, it makes a very powerful instrument for change. My last design tip is around creating conditions for and insisting on trees in adopted streets, in parking areas, trees in hard landscapes. That was the topic of the major guide I presented up front. And the impact on streetscapes, the friendliness of streets to alternative modes of transport, their comfort in terms of temperature. Trees make such a difference there. Also impacts on temperature within homes. It cannot be omitted from hard landscapes trees, and often they are. The underground design solutions are all available to make that a reality and a possibility, and I refer you to trees in hard landscapes for this. Now, my last 3 tips are around some of the planning practicalities. First one, investing time in pre-app meeting with the local authority to make sure you understand the design parameters up front. And also adopting a development team approach. Pretty much all the tips I've highlighted so far requires continued input from an arboricultural expert. So engaging with arboricultural expertise early on, retaining that expertise as long as possible throughout the project, not necessarily on a constant basis, but on a regular basis, provides such a return on investment in terms of enabling high-quality projects and cost savings, because then trees don't cost so much. My last tip is to use available templates to create strong planning conditions and enforce them. the issue of enforcement is one that local authorities have kept bringing up in interviews. There are no templates that exist that can be used by local authorities as far as planning, the writing of planning conditions. And enforcement is critical. Now there again, from a developer team perspective, retaining on board an arboricultural consultant who can help train the construction site supervisor and provide some supervision and monitoring can avoid getting into this situation, which is just a disaster. And I will end here. Thank you.
I've challenged all our speakers to speak within 10 minutes, so everyone's sort of trying to get through very quickly. There will be an opportunity for a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. Anne mentioned she's been doing a lot of work for the Trees and Design Action Group, and if you don't know the work of the Trees and Design Action Group, go onto their website, but also go across to the Urban Forest Pavilion over there, and there's people from there from the Trees and Design Action Group. They've got some fantastic resources which are free to download to help you understand how you can actually get trees into the urban environment. So trees are critically important in the urban environment, but the most other important thing is how we drain the urban environment. And for years we've been doing it through pipes and through underground drainage systems, but we know now that we need to think much more differently about how we actually slow the flow of our drainage from cities into our rivers and storm drains. So our next speaker is Kevin Barton from the Robert Bray Associates, award-winning designers on sustainable urban drainage. And if there's things you need to know about sustainable drainage, Kevin's the person to speak to, and hopefully in 10 minutes he'll convey everything you need to know about sustainable urban drainage.
Thanks, Peter. 10 minutes, biodiversity in suds, very big ask. I could speak for hours on this. Luckily, I don't have much coffee normally, and they didn't have decaf this morning, so I should be able to fit it in. So strap in. So as a minimum, our developments and suds should protect downstream. So for years, Peter refers to the sort of the impacts of the urban environment and the conventional drainage. This is the reality in 21st century London or any urban environment. Mass fish kills, masses of pollution, hydrocarbons, heavy metals, microplastics off tyre dust. Roughly 19,000 tons of tyre dust washes into our streams, rivers and seas every year. That's primary microplastics straight into those ecosystems. Urban heat, all those combined with misconnections and sewage causes this level of destruction of the natural environment. So as a minimum, we should be protecting the natural environments downstream. But the opportunity for SUDS is far more than that. We can provide biodiversity within our own development sites at site level, and we can do that for free or even at the same time as saving money compared to the sort of more conventional ways of managing runoff. Nature-based solutions are the most effective and the cheapest way of managing runoff. What we're looking to do is to catch water, slow it, clean it, use it, lose as much as possible, and then once we've done that, store and release slowly what's left over. And these environments, these sort of nature-based solutions, are by hands down the most cost-effective and the most effective way of managing runoff. And they deliver the most co-benefits. So around amenity, air quality, urban heat island effect, climate resilience. This is the scheme after last summer's drought. It's a lush urban landscape because it's getting an artificially large catchment of water, delivering to that green infrastructure every time it rains, even small rainfall events in the summer. But it requires a total mind shift in how we deal with runoff and how we deal with rain. For us, it's a precious resource that lands from the sky in our urban environments. And we need to treat it as an opportunity, not a problem to be solved. Conventionally, we treat rain as a problem to be solved. In our landscapes, in the future urban environment, we need to treat it as a resource to be exploited and used. So based on these nature-based approaches to SUDS, what SUDS does deliver is rain to a landscape. Rain is low nutrient, high oxygen, clean water when it falls out of the sky. When it hits our urban surfaces, it gets polluted. But if we clean that up, we have this amazing precious resource. It's no coincidence that the most biodiverse parts of the terrestrial planet are where there's the most rainfall. Rain is one of the key blocks of life. So it's an opportunity in development to create things like this. wetland habitats or a diversity of habitats, which we'll go through, within the heart of our urban developments, where these habitats are sort of so precious and valuable. If we don't clean that water as part of our SUD system, if we don't use what we call source control to remove the pollutants as they get washed off the urban surfaces, this is what we get. This is a basin in Scotland, one of the early SUD schemes, no source control, so all the pollution from that supermarket car park and all the litter goes to this basin, and there's almost zero biodiversity potential in this feature. And there's very few other co-benefits of this either. SUD creates, by its nature, because we're changing the topography of landscape, it creates diversity of topography, and that creates a diversity of conditions. We have drier areas, we have wetter areas, we have shady areas. In this scheme, a rain garden in a school, in the center of a school, obviously that landscape is sunken down, and we've also created little micropools in there to create even more of a mosaic of conditions and habitat to promote biodiversity. So SUDS, by its nature, it gives us the opportunities for biodiversity, even really without any effort, but just with a few tweaks we can enhance that. SUDS, if it's designed properly, we should be keeping the flow of water in the landscape. So in this scheme here, it's a science block with these sort of outdoor classrooms. We took the rainwater off the roof, down through these scientific demonstration features. There's a water wheel in the foreground, a tipping bucket in the background, and around the corners this other thing with a tube with holes in. So it's providing this sort of educational benefit. But then into this rill, then via an educational wetland with a dipping platform, into this swale, so always keeping the water flow on the surface. It's not gone underground at this point yet. This swale then leads, it's got wildflower in it, as well as the Rudbeckia flowers there. That leads directly to the nearest brook at the surface, no disconnection of the surface. Connected to a brook and that habitat corridor of that brook, which then is connected to the River Severn and its habitat corridor. So we have the opportunity for migration and connectivity of wildlife into our site, bringing that biodiversity and extending the foraging and the migration opportunities of biodiversity. So again, SUDS by its nature offers us these opportunities for biodiversity. And then there's the choice of planting. We can choose all sorts of different types of planting. We rarely use the kind of bog standard evergreen landscape palette of shrub planting. You can do that, but actually we find things like the meadow planting, herbaceous perennials, far more effective at promoting infiltration into the ground and holding the soil together. So here we've got a wildflower meadow in the heart of an urban housing scheme in Newham, where we've got play opportunities through this basin as well, so multiple benefits going on here, wildlife and people. And then in this scheme in White Hart Lane, almost zero biodiversity at this point, apart from a poor tree with its roots in the Moselle, but lots of tarmac around it. Transformed into these little urban oases. These are rain gardens taking polluted runoff straight off the busy highway, cleaning that runoff before it drops into the Moselle, and at the same time creating these little pockets of biodiversity opportunity that weren't in that landscape before. And these are doing an amazingly valuable job in terms of water management, protecting downstream water courses from flooding and pollution, but at the same time promoting biodiversity in that very hard, dense urban environment. And then there's the opportunity to supplement and enhance our SUDS features. And this is a great example of the idea I presented at the beginning, that you can do SUDS and you can get all these benefits for free or even saving money. This was a project we were brought in a little way down the line, Adam Khan Architects and Muff Architecture and Art. And we were brought in to sort of integrate SUDS design into this development. So we've got lots of SUDS on the ground floor. Well, one of the first things I looked at with Adam Khan Architects was the roofs. Can we put blue-green roofs on here? Very low-tech system, no plastic crates. There'll be lots of those for sale here, I'm sure, but no plastic crates on blue roofs. No plastic at all, in fact. Just we introduce a flow control. We store water in the soil where it's most valuable for plants and biodiversity, and occasionally over the top of the soil, but very rarely. So I presented this idea which then would generate biodiversity and lots of other benefits around climate resilience and urban heat island effect. The architect came back, said, we're going to do your blue roof idea. I said, you let me know which ones, and I'll colour them in on my plan. He said, all of them. And I said, well, why? And the QS basically did their calculations and compared to the tanks that they were going to do underground, it saved the project £800,000 to put blue-green roofs on every roof. It saved the developer £800,000, but also delivered the opportunity for amazing biodiversity and all the other co-benefits on top of that, on top of those roofs, for a saving. When we do that, any of these such features, we can then build in enhancements, whether that's log piles, insect homes, sand for ground-dwelling insects, changes in sort of gravel and brown roofs and things like this. We can integrate that easily within our SUDS features and exploit that biodiversity potential that SUDS naturally gives. Last couple of slides. There's a project we did at school which was really focused on newts, and here the wetlands we created were specifically designed as newt habitat. And on this site, there are no gullies. Gullies are wildlife traps. They kill wildlife, particularly amphibians. And on this project, no gullies. On the neighboring site, there was. And on this site, within 8 years, the recorded newt population, the ones that was actually found during surveys, went up from 0 to 170 odd, which indicates a massive explosion of newts. They were just the ones that were found. Obviously, it's a lot more than that living in there. But on the conventional site nearby, they surveyed 6 gullies, and in those, they collected 55 live newts of various forms. Now, they were alive at that point in time. They wouldn't be alive for long, so for every 55 that they found alive, every year, there's thousands of other newts and amphibians that get killed in gully pots. So this project not only created this amazingly valuable habitat for newts and lots of other biodiversity, it's also obviously doing all the other sort of functionality around SUDS. That's roughly 10 minutes, I think I've done. Yes, just working with nature, we can achieve great things in our urban environment. Thank you very much. Thanks.
That was SUDS and biodiversity and all the other issues in less than 10 minutes, so it's fantastic. So we've moved from trees in the hard landscape to thinking about how we design our drainage systems to provide nature-based solutions and enhance wildlife. And we can go a step further, and our next speaker is Dima Zoghaib from Arup, who's been working on a number of projects and plans and strategies around rewilding cities. Now clearly we're not going to turn our cities into the Serengeti or national parks or traditional national parks, but there's huge opportunities to think about how we bring and introduce nature into the city that not only benefits wildlife but benefits people too. So, Dima.
Right. Thanks, Peter, for this. So I just want to say a couple of things before I show the rest of my slides. I think that we've designed our cities to serve a specific functions to support human life activities, but also in the process, we have suppressed other forms of life and ecosystems. I don't know if you can recognize what this picture is, but it's actually a tree grill without a tree that actually has been abandoned. And you can see how ecosystems and nature has kind of flourished again. So the wildness that cities suppress is not just limited to fauna and flora, but also geophysical features such as rivers and streams. And in places where cities are not overly designed or managed, these systems burst out of their cage. There are also deliberate attempts to bring nature into cities, and not just green space, but also the dynamic rise and fall of flood levels, the changing of seasons, etc. And I'm just going to run through 3 images of kind of when we forget about spaces in our cities that we've designed, how actually nature prevails. So are we really suppressing nature through design? Possibly. So what is rewilding? And Rewilding Britain talks about bringing nature back to life restoring living systems, that's rewilding. This is the Olympic Park just around the corner from here, which was, as you all know, a brownfield site. But the landscape was designed to bring nature back, to see the flood levels rising and falling, and also restored habitats and created a space for wildlife. And I think the fact that people start seeing these things, seeing flooding, is really interesting because it becomes normal again. It's really about normalizing this again. And this map, I'm sure you've seen it, but this is the map of the hidden rivers of London. These are all the rivers that London was actually built on. And if you think about it, at the time, the value of development was thought to be higher than the benefits that these blue corridors can provide to our cities. And these rivers gave life, and again here we suppressed them, and the value of development was much higher. And this is London, across all of its green spaces, across scales, extra large to large, medium, and small. A little zoom in, we can start seeing the granularity of those green spaces, where there are street trees, where there are backyard gardens. And we know that more than 47% of London is green space. And with that comes numerous species that have actually survived and live in urban environments and in cities. So these cities are supporting numerous species, but also affecting others. But when we talk about urban green in the context of rewilding, it's just more than green space. We need to think about it in that it's considered as part of an urban ecosystem. And we know that London faces so many environmental and social challenges that can be addressed through rewilding. Of course, these are not specific challenges to London, but these are also challenges to other cities globally. So we need to think about rewilding as an ecological strategy, not just as an outcome of creating wilderness, or just to be successful. It has to be considered as a dynamic process of restoring ecosystem functionality. So can you imagine reimagining our reservoirs? This is Woodbury Down, Woodbury Wetlands, what was actually supposed to be providing drinking water for London. It was then decided to be built upon, but then they reimagined these reservoirs, and instead of rebuilding this development just across the reservoir, they actually looked down on it, created also one of London's nature reserves. So they protected it, they celebrated it, but also it responded to the high building density around it. So can you also imagine if we can start rediscovering some of these London rivers? I know there are attempts to do that and create these spaces. This is an example from a naturalization of one of the rivers in Switzerland. Light touch measures, but again, it creates greater value. And this is in Seoul, where again, they opened up the river to create this amazing linear park instead of the highway on the left-hand side that was built in the 60s. Or even in China, where actually they have this whole Sponge City program, again, encouraging wildlife, bringing it into developments. And I think that also buildings can contribute. So it's not just our public realm, but rewilding our buildings. I'm sure you know this is Bosco Verticale in Milan by Stefano Boeri, and the building on the right is a Oasia Hotel in Singapore. But I think also we should be thinking about maximizing underutilized spaces in cities for rewilding. This is Nigel Donnett's work, just again around the corner in Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. And how can we also start thinking about fewer hard surfaces, more spaces for plants to colonize and thrive, and thinking about creating more sustainable transport. But again, it's not only about green space, it's also about people and community. This is a scheme in Cardiff, Greener Grangetown, what really happens here is that the SUD scheme has created a strong identity for this neighborhood in Cardiff. And it's about education. I'm not sure why the slides are like that, but anyway, it's also about education. So when you are close to nature, people can understand it, can understand the value of it, can feel it, interact with it, and we should be thinking about educational opportunities also as we're rewilding our cities. And I think it's also about capacity building and empowering the community and creating awareness of the role of rewilding and green space in our cities. And this is the final slide to say that we need, as Peter said earlier, we need wider planning policies and frameworks for the interventions to be effective and impactful. And an example of that in London is the National Park City. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me okay at the back? Okay, so my name's Emma Ferranti. I work at the University of Birmingham. I work with the Trees and Design Action Group. Please come and speak to us on our stand after this. And I'm also currently seconded to Birmingham City Council, finding out how things really work in the real world outside of academia. So the work I'm doing today is something that I've done with Anne and the Trees and Design Action Group. And my question to you is, how much is that tree worth? Because to me, I quite like this tree. It has a nice bench in front of it, so I can sit down and have a nice rest while my kids run around. And this tree means a lot to me. And it's also in the park. It supports lots of nature and biodiversity. But unfortunately, as things stand in the council, that tree's worth nothing. You could chop it down and remove it, and it wouldn't be replaced. And that's the thing about green infrastructure in our urban areas. Unless it has a value, it will not be factored into decisions, because in our urban areas, all green infrastructure has a value. And what we've been doing with TDAG and with Anne is we've been trying to think about how we can use the valuation of green infrastructure, not to put arbitrary numbers on trees just for the sake of it, but to have a purpose and to make sure that by valuing that tree, it means that it's incorporated in decision making. And one of the resources we have developed is this. There are quite a few of them left on the stand. It's also freely available to download. Okay, so this is first steps in valuing trees and green infrastructure. If you've valued lots of trees before, then this probably isn't for you. You probably are aware of lots of the material in it. But what we think it's really useful for is it's for kind of setting the context of valuation, for introducing it to people who may not have valued trees before. And it talks you through some basic questions. So, for example, do you need to value in the first place? Is there a point to having a number on that tree or that green infrastructure? And it makes you think about what valuation is trying to achieve. It overviews the tools that we have available for valuation, and it gives you some kind of tips on where to start. So we think there are 4 situations where valuation can be useful in urban areas. The first one is it offers some kind of form of protection for trees. So if you look at figure 1 on the right-hand side, what we have here is a subsidence case, and it may be that the tree is causing subsidence, but if that tree has no value, the easy solution could be to just chop it down and see if the subsidence goes away. If you give that tree a value so that removing it becomes expensive, then this can hopefully encourage greater due diligence and a greater investigation into the cause of subsidence. And perhaps it is the tree, or perhaps it isn't, but by giving the tree a value and offering it some protection, you're encouraging a more thorough investigation. The second example is to do with compensation. If you have to take out a tree for some reason, here we're showing the redevelopment of a house into a bigger housing, into a block of flats. This required the removal of a large tree. If that tree has a value, and a really good tool in this kind of situation is the CAVOT tool, if that tree has a value, what you can do is you can ensure that the value of that tree is either reinvested directly into the development or into the surrounding neighbourhood to improve the green infrastructure and amenities. And one of the places where that's been really successful is the Elephant Park development in London. Anne mentioned it briefly, but the situation we had here was the developer took over a plot of land. It had social housing on, and the original plan was to remove all the housing and all the green infrastructure. But via kind of pressure from the community group who wanted to retain some of these 40-year-old trees, 30% of the existing trees were kept, which included 60% of the original canopy, and the trees that were removed were valued, and this commensurate compensation was invested not just on site but also in the surrounding neighbourhood. And so for the developer Lendlease, they were able to sell apartments, brand new apartments in a 40-year landscape, and it's also won loads of awards. So the other two situations where valuation can be useful is it can be useful at master planning stage. So figure 3, what we have here is you've got a design stage, and a tool which is useful for this purpose is the Natural Capital Planning tool. And what that can do is it can look at your green infrastructure that you have in your master plan and work out the ecosystem services that green infrastructure will develop over the next 25 years. And so then you can compare different alternatives, work out which one is offering you the maximum green natural capital reward over that time period, and it can help justify or perhaps even change investment decisions. This approach was used in Birmingham on green belt development, which was quite controversial. And what the council were able to do is they were able to show that although they were developing on the green space on this land, what they were doing is they were making it more useful from a natural capital perspective, changing what were agricultural fields into something that could give a bit back more back to the community. Valuation is also really useful for management, so figuring out what green infrastructure you have, so you know you can help plan more strategically going forward. And as I mentioned, it's really important to have a long-term strategy for your trees, and understanding the value of what you've got and therefore what you don't have is a really useful tool going forwards. And there was an iTree study at Wrexham Borough Council, and I would encourage you to read the report there to find out how they were able to use this to influence strategy going forward. So what we have so all these images were from this guide. What we have here is an overview of the tools which are available and the situations in which they are useful. And clearly we can't tell you everything about all of those tools in that one small table, and if you download the online guide, what you can do is then link through to the tool developer sites and find a little bit more about how to use it. So that's the work that we've been doing over the past year with TDAG and with Anne. And so just to come back to my original tree in the park. So my original tree in the park, which is worthless if you're going to remove it, we can give it a value with CAVAT, but then what's the next step? How do I make sure that Birmingham City Council value that tree the way I do, or the developer values that tree? And we think we've been using the business canvas model, which is a widely used business tool. It's just a simple spreadsheet with 9 different segments. And the idea is that you think strategically beyond putting an actual value on that tree or that piece of green infrastructure, to thinking about how you bring together the, sorry, that's it's like getting married again. Okay, so where was I? So use the business canvas model, because that allows you to think not just about valuation, but how you bring in your wider stakeholder groups and the people who can influence the decision. And so this is currently under peer review at the moment, but we hope to make this available via the TDAG web stage later in the year. But what the business canvas model tool does is it gets you to really focus on your change objective and what the behavior is that your valuation will change, how you will influence the decision, and who you need to engage with in order to impact that decision. So here are the different 9 segments for the business models canvas. You can find the business model canvas online. What we've done is we've just adapted them slightly to help valuation in a green infrastructure context. And so, because I've only got 1 minute, I can't talk about all these different segments, but what I would like to draw your attention to is this one, the change objective. And this is so important. You mustn't just value to put an arbitrary value on trees. You must always be thinking, what is the decision that we need to change with this valuation? And what difference will valuation make? The other thing which is really important are the key partners. So we could value that tree in the park, but unless we have the developers on board, unless we have the city council on board, unless we can influence the decision maker, the valuation will have no purpose. Other things to think about is who has access to data and who should be delivering this message to your stakeholder audience, and how can you bring everybody in right from the start and kind of go on sounds a bit naff, but go on a valuation journey together. So final comments. We believe that valuation can be used strategically to make sure that our green infrastructure assets are on par with our grey assets in urban areas. And it's not just about putting numbers on trees or the ecosystems they provide, but it's about influencing a decision to have a positive effect on the way our assets are managed in the urban environment. There's loads of these on the stand. Please come get one or download one online, and we look forward to sharing our business model canvas with you later on in the year. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma. There's been some difficult discussions in recent years when we start talking about economic valuation of things like green infrastructure. Some people we work with get very, very nervous about that. It's thinking about it's a commodification of nature. But it's more about how you influence decision makers. You know, there are multiple decisions being made every day in big cities for all sorts of reasons, and we need to be able to influence a whole range of different stakeholders. And economic valuation, some of the models that Emma's been talking about, are one way of influencing those decisions. It's not the only way, but we need to be engaged in those conversations. We also need to think differently about how we plan and design our green infrastructure. Quite often we're quite purist in what we do, and in recent years there's been lots of debate about different approaches to influencing and designing green infrastructure using non-native, native species, how we plant trees. And our next speaker, Victor Bomer from who's a lead consultant to Earthwatch Europe, has been developing some ideas around how we find new and innovative ways of increasing the amount of green infrastructure in our urban environments. So, Victor.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Victor Bomer, and I want to talk about tiny forests in the UK. Tiny forest, small forest, as the word says. These are planted forests in a built environment, very densely planted, high biodiversity, and they're planted according to a methodology called the Miyawaka method from Japan. And as a result of that, they grow very fast. And I will show you later in this presentation. I promise I'll make a short presentation. I have only 5 sheets, and I hope it will be short. First, for the people that don't know Earthwatch, we have a stand in the back of the Urban Forest Pavilion. Earthwatch is a charity, an environmental charity, and we advocate to society to live in the means and also to live in balance with nature. And we try to do this, to accomplish this, by connecting people to the natural world. We monitor natural resources and the services that come from that. And we also like to inform society how to make actions to improve all of this. So I am a researcher, I'm a landscape ecologist, but I have colleagues working on communication, on engagement, on fundraising. So we are a research, an independent research organization, acknowledged here in the UK, but we also are an engagement charity. We do engagement programs, we organize them, we facilitate them, we carry them out, and with that, together, we do citizen science. So all of our projects, research projects, are based on citizen science. So we have different programs within Earthwatch, and one program is Climate Proof Cities, of which I am the senior research lead. And currently we have 7 large projects all over the world. I don't want to go into all these individual projects, but what we actually do is monitor all these natural solutions, or all the different types of natural solutions, on supplying of services. So all these in the previous presentations, these examples that were named, we try to monitor them on how much service they deliver and in which way they do, and if there's a connection between services, a trade-off maybe. So what I really want to talk about is a tiny forest. Tomorrow I will give a more elaborate presentation in the Urban Forest Pavilion, but now to tell you shortly what it is. A tiny forest, it is a a small lap of territory. Sorry, it is like a tennis court, 20 by 10 meter size, so you can fit it in the built environment almost anywhere. You have to pre-treat the soil all organically, no chemicals added. And with this pre-treatment and specific species selection and species combination in planting, all according to this Miyawaki method, you can make a tiny forest. It's a fast-growing forest. There are 600 saplings you plant on this patch, and it supplies you all kinds of services, of course. And it is not a new concept, I have to admit. It is the concept has already been tested in the Netherlands. The oldest tiny forest there is 5 years now, and the trees are now up to 8 to 10 meters high, and they start from 80 centimeter saplings. So it's a very dense forest with 600 trees in only 200 square meters. You would say there's a lot of mortality. In the first 5 years in the Netherlands, there's hardly any mortality being aware of. And what we do is try to set up all different kinds of tiny forests here in the UK. But it's not only about setting up a tiny forest, it's very much also in engagement. Because we believe if we talk about the value of trees, about our green infrastructure, you have to involve people, you have to involve citizens, children, or big corporates. And in this way, we develop engagement programs, making people aware of the natural surroundings, how it works, what kind of services it provides, and take them out into these natural solutions and let them measure certain things so they can really experience differences. And with that, we have our monitoring program, which will give us a lot of data. And we have real high ambition. We want to achieve or implement around 100 forests in the coming 4 years in the UK, spread over all kinds of cities. And we're starting already next week. Next week, our first tiny forest will be planted in Witney County, or Witney. 2 weeks later, we will plant one in Oxford. And of course, next year, we want to plant even more. And our monitoring program, because for each tiny forest is connected with an engagement program of which the monitoring is taken care of. And we monitor on 4 benefits, that's biodiversity, thermal comfort, flood mitigation, and CO2 capture. And later on, when we have a larger group of tiny forests, we also apply for grants to make in-depth research on all kinds of different services, like air quality improvement or noise reduction, things like that. So this is actually my presentation, short enough, I guess. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. Because everyone's been so diligent in their timekeeping, we've actually got time for questions. So can I ask all the speakers to come up onto the stage? So in this sort of series of short presentations, we've moved from the tree canopy down to water percolating through the soils, from city-wide strategies to tiny forests, and we've covered quite a lot of ground in quite a short period of time, and perhaps some areas of controversy too. So I'd really welcome some questions from people in the audience about some of the issues that have been raised by the speakers today. So over to you. You put your hands up and someone will come on.
Hi, I'm Lynn Campbell from Solid and Chipping Norton. Question for Kevin, really, as a fellow SUDS enthusiast. I design drainage and highways, and I think we've moved on a lot, certainly in the last 10 years. But the final, more difficult problem we're facing is for housing developments. I don't know if you agree, but I'm still finding that housing developments themselves are very barren landscapes. I mean, you could put Bear Grylls in there and he'd die within a week. There's just nothing. It's how how are we going to? I mean, maybe we can put the value on the trees and the green infrastructure that has been discussed. Is this what you're finding, and how are we going to get over it? Because it still seems quite static in housing, and obviously there's a lot of pressure now to build more houses.
Yep. Okay. So we can't hear you very well up here. Speakers are all
So
facing the wrong way.
shall I just quickly repeat the question? So the question was about how that there's a huge pressure to build new housing developments all across the country, and a lot of those housing developments perhaps aren't applying some of these principles
I
and
find
these
they're the
processes.
most
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah.
Most.
Absolutely. I mean, I did a poll of a number of lead local flood authorities, planning authorities, and around 98 to 99% of planning applications, basically, which is mostly housing, is, as far as they're concerned, well, it's not really SUDS. It's pipe to pond, it's pipe to tank. It's not SUDS. It's not even really delivering the minimum standards that SUDS should be delivering. But this is 98 to 99% of our reality at the moment, particularly in housing schemes. It's like an ocean liner trying to turn. It's taking a long time. We've been doing this since the mid-90s, and I think when Bob, my partner in the business, when Bob set up doing SUDS in the mid-90s, and overnight just did nothing but SUDS from the mid-90s, I think if he'd have thought where it would be in 2020, it wouldn't be 98 to 99% of housing schemes are still doing really bad schemes. It's so slow to take up. I think part of the problem is the message that actually it saves developers money to design it well is not getting across. I mean, £800,000 on an urban development by putting blue roofs on every roof. What they do instead in London is they put it underground in sub-basements with pumps to pump it up to sewers, which are higher than the tanks that they're storing it in, when they could do it up on a roof and deliver all those multiple benefits. It's a no-brainer in every way, but because I think the key thing is you're delivering multiple benefits, you're delivering all these co-benefits, and if a government is asking house builders to deliver all these multiple benefits, the assumption is there's going to be a cost and there's an automatic backlash. I'd like to think the cat's out the bag, but it's a cat out the bag on an ocean liner trying to turn a thing. It's just taking a long time.
I think the highways as well, as a road designer, the highways are still giving us problems as well, putting swales in, stuff like that.
Definitely.
And we've got to really start thinking differently. But it's got to come from government and the councils.
Well, it needs to come.
as well.
Yeah, it needs to come from above. So highways department need to be told this is the future. You know, forget how we used to do it. That is the past. The future will look like this. You need to be part of that future or get off. And we have the examples now. So we've got an adopted permeable highway next to what will be called Tottenham Hotspur Station, White Hart Lane Station. Adopted permeable highway. They've just built a new station off that adopted permeable highway. It's got a structural tree pit underneath it, which unfortunately, because of Tottenham Hotspur's sort of crowd control, they're not going to plant the trees because it takes up too much space and it affects the crowd control, even though I demonstrated it shouldn't. But underneath there, without trees planted in it, is a structural tree pit underneath an adopted highway. And there are boroughs that are taking it on, and I think the more and more examples we get, and the more time, Oxford's doing adopted permeable highways for donkey's years, and it's not a problem. Really low maintenance, no issues long term. It's using all those examples, getting them out there to show those highways departments, you need to do this. It's not a problem. Speak to these people; they'll tell you it's not a problem. Here's how to do it.
Just any other thoughts from
Do I
members of
sound
the panel?
frustrated?
Bear in mind we've got 10 minutes for questions, so try to keep your comments brief.
I don't know. Okay. I just wanted to add also one point is that actually Wales, they have issued, I think last year, Schedule 3, which makes sure that all developers develop SUDS on their new schemes. We don't have this in England, but we do need a similar policy that that makes it a binding to deliver SUDS.
We do in England. It's the difference in Wales is that the local authority are obliged to adopt. So that's the key difference. But in England, all major developments
So we need to do that, right? Yeah.
A quick comment from Victor.
A quick point then. My experience in the Netherlands is that if you want to supply these multiple benefits, you also have to include the beneficiaries, because if you are only a project developer that is making houses or a road or whatever, you also have to include a water board or people that are actually using this solution. Otherwise, it's the first thing that is dropped off the project because of financial reasons.
So there was another question from a lady down here.
Hello, Susan May, Urban Design London. Just sort of slightly continuing the theme, because I was involved in previous employment with the GLA, who I think
Can you hold the microphone a bit?
were developing a guide on SUDS, and I was directly engaging with the consultant who was doing this, and I did come across a barrier that I think is around communications, in that there is a tendency with even the word SUDS is quite a technical word. And when you get into the tech, people get very excited about technology around SUDS, but that is the opposite of what you need to be doing in terms of engaging with developers. The more technology and the more complexity, the more they're likely to run away. So I was trying to communicate with the consultant that what we need is to bring up front those no-cost saving type of solutions and push to the back the more complex engineered solutions, and I think that just didn't seem to get through at all. So if there could be a message back to the SUDS community in terms of your engagement with developers, it is that you need to bring to the fore the quick win, easy options, benefits, saving money, and just really focus on them, possibly even change the name of SUDS or make SUDS a kind of subtext. Because I think personally SUDS is just not a user-friendly term, and maybe it needs to be rethought of to kind of capture the the imagination of the public and to sway this kind of general, to crack through this 99% that's really a real problem. So I don't know if there's any comments on that.
Let Emma start with that one.
Is this on? Brilliant. So what you're saying about SUDS and about how you need broader stakeholder engagement and how the word itself is a little bit off-putty, it made me think back to how we'd use the business model canvas to try and think about all these issues in advance and kind of really make sure we'd planned out everything in all these different segments, thought about our partners and stuff. And I'm wondering, is there an opportunity to have a business model canvas for SUDS, so you're thinking about how you communicate the message, the stakeholders you need to have involved, and this will help you have greater success in selling the idea to local authorities? I don't know, just putting it out there.
On some of our projects recently, particularly when we're dealing with communities, we talk about rain gardens and rainscapes. They're friendly terms. They also sort of indicate what it's about, the word garden and scape, and we find we get a lot more engagement than exactly that sort of technical. And I think it's part of the problem. It puts a lot of designers off. I remember in the mid-90s when I first heard about it, scoffing at the idea of sustainable urban drainage systems. For designers, drainage is typically something we want to minimize down to a slop drain if possible, and then it's someone else's problem. I didn't realize that this was something so full of opportunity for me as a designer and for the things I design, for the schemes I design. Certainly it put me off, and it was another 15, 20 years later that I discovered it and realized how wonderful it is.
I agree with Kevin. You have to talk about the solutions themselves. And a funny thing, because I also do a project for the TU Dublin, mostly with engineers. They were complaining to me about the word nature-based solutions because they could not understand the term, and they want something like SUDS, a more technical thing. So it's all based around to who are you talking, and I mean you can talk endlessly about definitions, but it's all about the solutions themselves.
I think the thing I'd add is it's actually about conversations with each other. We try and find like the perfect policy, the perfect way to communicate stuff. Actually, it's forums like this, it's conversations you have with other colleagues and other disciplines, and just constantly having those conversations over and over again, and you just change people's mindsets over time. I think we live in a sort of a society where we want instant solutions. I think the policy framework around green infrastructure and urban greening has been something that's been developed over the last 5-10 years. It takes time for that to filter through, to actually land and people start taking it up. So I guess one of the things I've learned over 20-30 years is don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Find the solutions which work, find the people who are actually making those solutions work, and signpost and point to them. Point to the good stuff, don't point to the bad stuff. Any other questions?
Hello, I'm Murray Smith from Untitled Practice Landscape Architects. I have a question relating to this kind of move that we seem to be on towards quantitative evaluation of landscape quality. Well, I guess the quality is the bit of the question. How do the panel think that we can ensure that landscape quality is maintained if the tools we're using are based on quantitative appraisals? I mean, natural systems in the natural world have interrelationships, complex interrelationships with each other. There's certain processes at play, and I feel like there's a drift in policy terms towards making decisions that are quite simple, but not necessarily for the best reasons.
Who wants to attempt to answer that one?
I'm happy to have a crack at this. I think there are some assessment tools that are purely qualitative based in terms of even assessments of design. If I think of the Cape Space Shaper tool, which was around the design of community space with the communities, it's all designed around enabling communities to assess the quality of design proposals and participate in. So I think the point around valuation, which I think we tried to put really at the heart of our work with Emma, is around why are you trying to value for? And we've narrowed it to those scenarios where we don't think necessarily valuation is the paramount to achieving good design. What we're saying is in some context, putting a value really enables to shift the conversation and enabling engagement where so far we haven't managed to get proper engagement, so that the investment, the time, the effort spent around shifting from our usual ways of working to being able to incorporate landscape elements, vegetation, green infrastructure, however you want to call it, nature, is made much more present. I don't think any of these quantitative tools necessarily solve the design problem. However, I would say that I have seen examples where using an approach that seeks to look at some of the quantitative outcomes across a wide range of ecosystem services has sometimes challenged the designer in rethinking the design. Most of the some of the tools, especially if I can start to get technical, the Green Infrastructure Evaluation Toolkit, for instance, a lot of the tools, the benefits, they're derived from people use of the assets. So it puts an onus on how user-friendly have you made this space. I think sometimes the use of these tools provides another way in thinking about design. I'm not, again, advocating that it's the only way, but my experience so far, has always been enriching rather than actually impoverishing the conversation.
Just to draw a comment to when you talked about your SUDS presentation, you said it was the money saved that influenced the decision to have the blue-green roofs on there. And if money wasn't brought into it, then maybe that decision wouldn't have been made, and it didn't do anything to impact the quality of the design, did it? I'm sure. So it's just.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is that these are complex problems, complex issues, and we need to think about issues around. We need to have quantitative assessment tools. We need to think about quality. We also need to think about different forms of valuation. So the whole thing about valuing green infrastructure is really thorny and really controversial. People say, well, are you commodifying the natural environment? But it's about trying to find different arguments for different audiences, because you've got to influence a whole range of different decision makers. So it's not an either or, it's about marshalling your arguments, marshalling your ideas, and presenting different ways of understanding the benefits, the value of your green infrastructure, because you've got to convince a multiple range of stakeholders. So it is complex, it is difficult. living in cities and planning and designing cities is complex and difficult, and we shouldn't shy away from that complexity and difficulty. We actually try and find the ways in which we can make the arguments which we think make sense actually land and change the way in which we plan and design cities. We're coming to the end of this session. Are there any specific questions again from the audience before I wrap up? Oh, one right at the back.
Hi, Stephanie King from BRE. Really simple question about the tiny forests. How accessible are they? Do you have to exclude people from them in order for them to thrive? Or is there space for them to become a resource that people can use while they're growing?
Yeah, we also want to use them as open air classrooms. You can make them in different shapes. Eh? They don't have to be a rectangular. You can also make them in a half circle or something like that. It's actually quite difficult to enter the forest because they're super dense. And I've been to the ones in the Netherlands. You cannot really enter without breaking branches or trees. So, and there's also a fence around it because you want to keep out mostly dogs and dog owners. But so it is possible to enjoy it because the matter of how you shape it, but to enter it is not really favorable.
Thank you.
How critical is the width? How critical are the dimensions? Can it be longer and thinner?
You have to have it at least 4 meters wide.
That's a good note to end on, a quantitative assessment of a tiny forest, a specific size for a tiny forest. We've come to the end of our session. First of all, can you just thank the speakers? Thank you for listening, and I think we'll all be around here for the next 5-10 minutes. If you've got any further questions or things to follow up, please come and talk to us. And please go and look at the Urban Forest Pavilion and some of the other product suppliers and other organisations here who are really beginning to make green infrastructure something that is real in the city rather than something which is this sort of notional idea that we've been championing for a long time. So thank you very much.